Okay, we're recording. So, hello, Cary. It's so nice to see you, and thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me today.
My pleasure. Nice to be here.
All right, so you have a new book coming out in July, and it's called Jagged Ontologies. So, I know you wrote the book called What is Posthumanism? And I'm going to ask you to explain that to me in as brief and simple of terms as you possibly can. Just what the heck is posthumanism?
Yeah, that's actually a question I get asked a lot, and it's a good question because there's a lot of um, confusion, I think, of terminology in the contemporary sort of philosophical and theoretical landscape. Um, for example, around posthumanism versus the term posthuman, right? And then there's another term, adjacent term that often gets mixed up with it called transhumanism, right? And transhumanism is that's kind of a whole other conversation. But what I want to clarify for me, and this is I talk about this in the very beginning of what is posthumanism. Posthumanism for me is not about transcending the human. It's not about moving beyond the human, either by means of technology or some other way. It's real. Posthumanism is about trying to come up with a way of thinking about questions that we're all interested in that aren't limited by a humanist, the humanist philosophical and theoretical frameworks that we've traditionally used to think about them. So let me just give you a really clear example, and I talk about this in the book. Let's take the question of animal rights, for example, right? So a lot of people would agree, I think, that the objectives of animal rights are good to recognize, the moral standing of not just human beings, but other beings where we find that moral standing exists, and we want to honor that, including in law, right? So I think everyone would look at that and say, well, wow, that's really an anti-anthropocentric thing to do. This is good that we're not, trafficking in human exceptionalism. We're trying to actually get beyond human exceptionalism, right, with animal rights. But what you find, and this goes back to my point about humanist philosophical frameworks, what you find in a lot of animal rights literature, and the two most famous examples are probably Peter Singer's utilitarian way of thinking about this in Animal Liberation, and Tom Reagan's way of thinking about it in a book called The Case for Animal Rights. What you actually end up finding in animal rights philosophy, just to make a very long story short, is that the argument ends up saying that we should recognize the moral standing of animals insofar as they possess moral and behavioral, et cetera, characteristics that are actually like us, right? And there's a long list of those. The ability to suffer for Singer is primary, but there's a long list of these characteristics, right? So the problem, this is kind of, I think, a good example that people understand, because the problem is what we're trying to do in trying to move beyond anthropocentrism and human exceptionalism, is we're trying to recognize other forms of life and their value in their own terms, right? Not insofar as they're like us or not, not like us, some normative idea that we have of what human beings are like, right? So a post-humanist way of trying to think about that, which is part of what I'm trying to do in Jagged Ontologies, is to think about the heterogeneity and the multiplicity that exists of life in the biosphere, but within a different kind of theoretical and philosophical framework that doesn't always come back to some normative idea of the human. And for that, the toolbox that we've inherited from the humanist tradition, just isn't sufficient. It actually doesn't even give us a really good description of what human beings are actually like, right? So when I say posthumanism, I want to sharply distinguish it from the way that the term posthuman is often used, which seems to suggest in many places, seems to suggest leaving behind or transcending or moving on beyond, our limitations and our finitude and our embodied groundedness and our embeddedness in being human, right? So that's not what I'm talking about. And I'm definitely not talking about transhumanism. I'm going to tell you a really funny story here.
Okay.
This is going to seem like a digression, but it's worth going into. So, as everybody knows, a few weeks ago, the Pope issued an encyclical about AI and about the dangers of AI and its effect on humanity, so on and so forth. And almost all of what he says about those questions in the encyclical, I think, are good points, right? But the encyclical is based on a prior document by the International Theological Commission called Quo Vadis Humanitas. And in that document, and this is cited in the Pope's encyclical, there's a characterization of posthumanism. The term is actually used in the document. Uh, that sounds a lot like transhumanism, right? And part of the context here again is technological. It's AI. How's this going to affect the human? And my book, What is Posthumanism, and three other books are cited as evidence of this very dangerous post-humanist position that then the Pope in his encyclical actually cites and kind of reproduces, right? And so this is kind of a funny question, like, I think the Pope loves me, but he doesn't know it yet because I was told about this by a colleague whose work is also cited in that document. And I told her and actually co-signed a letter to the Pope asking to have a conversation about this, which I'm sure won't happen. But I said, look, in the introduction to What is Posthumanism, I explicitly say that posthumanism, as I use the term, is against transhumanism. And one of the chief philosophers associated with transhumanism, Nick Bostrom at Oxford, I actually cite him by way of example in the introduction, right? So that's how much confusion there is about what these terms mean. Posthumanism isn't it's not anti-humanist and it's not anti-human. It's just simply saying, look, we've got theoretical tools and philosophical tools now to think about these questions, that we didn't have 500 years ago, and we should use them, right? So that's my sense of posthumanism.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. You did use a lot of big words that I also still did not quite understand, but thankfully I have the captions and I can go back and look those up. No, so the thing is that I think that I'm so coming back to being the publicist for these books, I think that there is an audience for these books that they're intended for, sure, but I think that there is also a broader audience that may be interested in these kinds of complex ideas, if they just knew what the heck it was saying, and
Yeah,
so that's kind of why I wanted to try to get at this with some like layman's terms and
yeah, yeah,
so with that in mind, and with what is posthumanism in mind, I want to bring us back to Jagged Ontologies. So reading reading the back cover copy was difficult for me. And to be fair, all I really need to do is be able to identify the appropriate audience and get it
right.
into the media that they will encounter to make them want this book. And if I was a subject matter expert on every subject that we published, which is a lot of subjects, I would go clean up on Jeopardy and then get the heck out of Dodge. So yeah, I'm not expected to be a subject matter expert, but I am
Right.
interested in
Yeah.
this is saying. And so what I'm
Yeah.
hoping you can do is explain just a little bit in as simple of terms as possible, just what now then is Jagged Ontologies? What argument are you trying to make? What is this book about?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful here to talk about the architecture of the book, how the book is built actually, and then work backwards actually in terms of how the book is built. So the Jagged Ontologies refers to an argument that I'm making in the book about novelty, creativity, heterogeneity of different forms of life in the biosphere and how that happens, right? So early on in the book, I actually try to lay a kind of theoretical and philosophical foundation for that argument that involves theories like autopoiesis and involves theoretical biology and involves ecology and work on niche formation and so on and so forth. So work in the sciences, and I try to stitch that together with a philosophical argument as well. But then as the book progresses, the last three chapters of the book really sort of step back and say, okay, we've had all these theoretical and philosophical arguments about this, and I've made my case. Like, who cares, right? How does this play out on the ground, right? And I'll give you an example. The last chapter of the book, and this is relevant to your question about audience, is called "What Species is Multi-Species Justice?" And it's centered on two multi-species justice initiatives that I've been involved with over the past few years. One called the Multi-Species Constitution, which was a project at the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, and the other one, which is ongoing, called Animals in the Room, which is based in the United Kingdom, although we have people from all over the world involved in it, and is going to be a nonprofit in the UK. And both of these are operating in the neighborhood of what's often called, in popular discourse, you read about this in the newspapers all the time, so-called rights of nature arguments, right? So the multi-species constitution is more squarely aligned with a lot of conversation about, the rights of nature. And Animals in the Room is really kind of more focused on a case-by-case basis of looking at particular animals, right? So Animals in the Room wants to say, look, it's not good enough for us to just in the legal domain and in policy and government and so on. It's not good enough for us to just speak on behalf of animals. We need to try to figure out a way to give them a chance to speak for themselves, to tell us, to indicate to us, and that's different for different animals, how they can do this, to indicate to us what they think is best for them. And then we need to incorporate that into our policies at the municipal level, at the federal level, so on and so forth, right? The multi-species constitution is really more a kind of rights of nature argument, right? So there's been a lot of energy internationally for years now around these questions. Ecuador, for example, amended their national constitution several years ago to include rights of nature, Pachamama, rights of nature in the Constitution explicitly. And this has happened in other countries as well, right? So entire ecosystems, potentially, not just individual animals in this situation, become the subjects of governmental recognition and protection, right? So one thing that I do in the last chapter is to say, look, these are arguments about rights of nature and protecting non-human life. These are arguments that have a long history going back to the 1970s and 80s, at least, around what was then called deep ecology, right? And a whole philosophical, and legal framework that emerged from that. So the audience for the book, in a way, is people who've always been interested in those kinds of questions, animal rights questions, environmental ethics questions, so on and so forth. And so what I try to do in the book is to say, look, we've done all the philosophical and theoretical spade work. Now, how does that change, how we look at and maybe distinguish, say, animal rights movements from rights of nature movements? And my argument is actually that they're two different things, right? For lots of complicated reasons, and they require different kinds of methodologies. The thing that's being protected in rights of nature arguments is a very different thing, a much more abstract thing than, say, working on an animal rights case for a particular type of creature, right? This has a long history, actually, in debates between environmental ethics people and animal rights people, right? As I talk about in the book, a classic case is like white-tailed deer in North America, right? Animal rights people are going to say, look, it's not okay to just go out and kill them, because they're eating people's gardens. These are creatures, with a life. They live in a life world. They have strong connections with others of their kind, so on and so forth. They live in social groups, etc. Right. So you can't just go out and cull them, right? Any more than you can do that with human beings who happen to be inconvenient for whatever reason, right? So the unit of justice, right, the thing that's being protected in the animal rights argument is very different from the environmental ethics argument, because those people would say, well, hang on a second. What's important here is not the individual animal, it's the biodiversity of the entire ecosystem. That's what needs to be protected, right? And if white-tailed deer are going around and eating everything in sight, then that's not only bad for them and their population, it's bad for other creatures in the ecosystem as well, right? So what you need, and I try to explore this in the book, what you need is a kind of vocabulary that can make these kinds of distinctions and see what kinds of assumptions are underneath, both of those arguments, right? So I do try, despite all the kind of technical vocabulary that you were talking about in the book, I try to show in that chapter, and in the chapter before it, which is really about how do we think about social complexity, right? I try to go into some practical examples of why having a new kind of vocabulary matters when we think about this question of jagged ontologies, when we think about biopolitical questions, when we think about, the last third of the book is really concerned with saying, look, what this is really about in the most radical sense is democracy, right? Does democracy include, and how can it include, not just human beings, right, but other forms of life, right? So that's kind of where practically speaking, that's where the rubber really meets the road, right? Late in the book.
Okay. So I can tell you right now that just your explanation that you just provided made me 1,000 times more interested in this book.
Yeah, good.
You know,
That's why we're doing this, right?
exactly. And the
Yeah,
thing is that I also, I want to be able to share it with people who would also be interested in this topic. But we also don't want to misrepresent what's in the book by making it sound too easy. So that brings us to the books that you recommend um,
right.
prior to reading Jagged Ontologies, because it may not be something that just a layperson would pick up and read and understand outright. So perhaps, I had asked you what people might need to know before tackling Jagged Ontologies, and you gave me a list of 5 books. Um, and those include Steps to an Ecology of Mind by Gregory Bateson, The Tree of Knowledge, The Biological Roots of Human Understanding by Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. I'm not sure if I'm saying those right.
Yep, yep.
um, A World Beyond Physics, The Emergence and Evolution of Life by Stuart Kauffman, Adam's Task, Calling Animals by Name by Vicki Hearne, and of course, What is Posthumanism by
Of course.
Oh.
Yeah,
So, thank
yeah.
you so much for that list. I mean, did you have any kind of final thoughts that you wanted to share before we wrap up?
Well, I'll just say about the list very briefly, and this is I'll give some thumbnails that might interest people in these books more. I have often said I read Gregory Bateson's book when I was an undergraduate in college in a cultural anthropology class, and if there's one book that I could require for every freshman in college and universities anywhere, it would be that book. And there's lots of reasons, but the reason for me that is most important is Bateson really introduces you how to think about things in terms of systems and unities and composed wholes, not atomistically, right? So Bateson will often say, what's important is not what something's made of, is what is its pattern, right? So he has a great example in the book. He says, okay, this great essay called Form, Substance, and Difference. And he says, what's the difference between this lectern here and this piece of chalk? And whenever I use this with my students in class, of course, none of them has any idea what the answer is. And there's a good reason, because the answer is there's only one right answer to that question, and it's, well, it depends. And Bateson's point is, well, what does it depend on? And it depends on the frame, or as he puts it, the map that you're using to distinguish the two. And maps are always made up of differences, right? So the difference between the lectern and the piece of chalk could be their color, could be their relative position in the room, could be their density, could be their mass. There's a potentially infinite list of differences depending on what map you're using, as Bateson puts it. And a phrase that he borrows that he uses all the time is that the map is not the territory, right? So what Bateson teaches you to do is to think about things in terms of form, right? And this was attractive to me in my training because a lot of thinking in systems theory and what was then called cybernetics, a lot of it is actually really counterintuitive. But the counterintuitive part is exactly what enables you to come back to very familiar questions, like the animal rights question I was talking about earlier, and really kind of see them in a new way, right? And Bateson does this, I won't go into it, but Bateson does this across many, many different domains. Um, Everything from psychotherapy to ecology to information theory, and fantastic work on non-human communication in dolphins and in wolves, in a lot of domains. So Bateson for me gave me one of my main two theoretical tools that I use in what is posthumanism and in Jagged Ontologies, and that's systems theory, right? Because to go back to what I was saying about posthumanism earlier and coming up with a different toolbox, what's great about systems theory is it allows you to use the same theoretical frameworks to talk about shared phenomena across what we usually take to be very different domains. Let's say human and animal, or let's say biological and mechanical, right? So the great example in systems theory is the feedback loop, right? You can use the cybernetic or systems theory formal model of feedback to talk about how an HVAC system works in your house. You set a thermostat, right? And the feedback loop uses information to achieve homeostasis to keep the temperature at 73 degrees. But you can use exactly the same model to talk about thermoregulation in warm-blooded animals, right? Now, what do we have? We have a way to talk about this. And guess what? The terms human and animal and machine haven't done any heavy lifting, right? So that's where systems theory for me became really, really important as I was trying to think across these jagged ontologies that exist so heterogeneously in the biosphere in ways that overlap in highly specific ways with each other and with the human domain. Maturana and Varela's book, The Tree of Knowledge, is kind of step two, I would say, on that reading list. It's what's often called second order systems theory. They are two Chilean neuroscientists. I think it's a really brilliant book because it gives you a comprehensive theory that moves from the level of the cell all the way up through processes of social organization in humans and animals and communication. And finally, as the title suggests, how that affects how we think about what the mind is and what cognition is. Very, very important work in theoretical biology, but it goes way beyond theoretical biology. And they're both very, very well known, Maturana and Varela. Stu Kauffman's work, A World Beyond Physics. I've loved Stu's work since I was a student also. Um, the simple way to describe that book is it's important to a fundamental argument in Jagged Ontologies. And that is that living systems and physical systems are two different things. They have different qualitatively different modes of causation involved. How temporality operates in those systems is very, very different. And this is important because in the current moment, to go back to the audience for the book, in the current moment, a lot of what you read, and that's just kind of in the air, very readily likes to collapse living systems and physical systems and computational systems as if the differences between them didn't really matter, right? So, for example, if you think about a lot of the dominant paradigms in the sciences, including in molecular biology, right? They do this all the time. It's basically an engineering kind of idea, right, of what life is and how it can be manipulated, right, and how it can be studied and so on and so forth, right? And I'm not saying that that work can't be done. I mean, there are things you can do within those domains. But Stu's argument, which I find completely convincing, and a companion book of his is actually called Humanity in a Creative Universe, um, is also worth reading, is to say, look, what's going on in the biosphere is not subject to the predictive calculation that rules in the domain of the physical sciences and in computation, right? He makes a very compelling argument, I think, that in the evolution of the biosphere, there are no entailing laws, as he puts it, right? That doesn't mean that there aren't constraints on what can happen, but there are no entailing laws for one very simple reason, that if organisms change the environment that changes them, which we know from biology, if that's true, think about beaver dams, for example, right? Beavers are adapting to their environment by building dams, but that changes the environment on its own, right? That's another one of these feedback loops we were talking about, right? So if it's true that organisms change the environment that changes them, then Stu's argument is that means you can't have a stable, what's called a phase space in physics for carrying out predictive equations to build entailing laws for evolution, right? What does that mean? It means the biosphere is very unpredictably, dynamically creative, right? In ways that we can't possibly predict. So that's the central value, I think, of Stu's book. Finally, Vicki Hearne's book, Adam's Task. Vicki was an amazing person. She was a poet, kind of an armchair philosopher, but actually, I think a really good one. More serious philosopher than she gets credit for. And also a master horse trainer and dog trainer, one of the best in the world. And her book is just a really beautiful and probing exploration based on her work with animals about how two different creatures who have very different bodies, who live in very, very different worlds, how they can enter into this third domain that they build together through communication. And by that, I don't mean language, right? I mean, I'm talking about communication in a much broader sense, body language, gesture, tone of voice. She explores how these multi species communities can come into being, right? And why that matters. And I think it's a very, very profound book. I've often said to people, you know, if I gave her book to 100 people, and then I gave a pile of lab studies based on blood work and brain scans and other things of dogs, to those same people, and I had them read both, and I said to them, who has more knowledge of what a dog's mind is like? And 100 out of 100 would say Vicki Hearne does, right? So I think it's a really profound philosophical demonstration, not just of why it's important to take seriously and explore our openness to non-human forms of life and how we can interact with it. But also, I think, also what we think philosophy is, what we think theory is, why it exists, what its value is. And I think it's a book that demonstrates that beautifully.
That's this has all been so amazing. I feel like my IQ has jumped up several points just by talking to you. And then I also have a few more books to add to my TBR pile. So
Yes, you do.
yeah, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk about all of this with me. I think it'll be, of incredible value to others as well. That when we share this and that share this list, and I think you might just get yourself a few more fans.
Well, I want to thank you, not just on behalf of the book, but as some of the people watching this may know, also on behalf of the press, because, almost 20 years ago, I started the Posthumanities series as the founding editor of that. And we've published almost 80 books at this point in the series. So I want to thank you for your work on behalf of the press as well. Job well done.
Thank you. It's been so great to talk to you.